Good morning, everybody. Deism is a philosophical and religious belief system that showed up in what's known as the Enlightenment era. This era was in the 16 and 1700s, mostly in Europe, but also moved to America with the people who moved to Europe, or from Europe to America. Deism acknowledges the existence of a creator or a higher power, but this creator in deism set the world in motion and then backed away. The creator doesn't interfere with the cogs and the machinery that's already turning, and so as a result, deism rejects the idea of divine intervention in the world, either by the presence of miracles or either in speaking to humans in the form of revealed religion. So several of the American founding fathers, as you may or may not know, were in fact deists. And you can see some of their beliefs shown in our founding documents. Thomas Jefferson said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Thomas Paine was an outspoken part of the Revolution and was a very dominant writer. He was also a profound deist, and some of his words were very prevalent in some of the writings that were published and were widely read throughout that day. Both Paine and Jefferson, being deists, rejected organized religion, and in reflection of this rejection, Thomas Jefferson created his own Bible, which is known as the Jefferson Bible. And you can see it, it's pictured here. I think there are a few different copies, but this one is currently in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. He literally cut out parts of the Bible, and he chose which parts to cut out. He cut out the parts that had anything to do with God intervening in the world. So the supernatural events in the Bible, Jesus' miracles, these were all cut out. Parts where God spoke to or directly intervened and changed the natural working of the world. And instead, what you have as a result are just a collection of general moral teachings and do good to one another isms. It lacks the completeness that God wanted in the Bible, and it's almost comical when you see it. It's just scissors cutting out the words of God. But this reflects this thought of deism. And deism, as time went on, fell out of favor, like many Enlightenment ideologies. But although it may not really be practiced today and actively thought of the way that it once was, there are some ways in which deism creeps into our own personal lives. And this morning, I'd like to specifically talk about prayer. The idea of an intervening God can be difficult to really internalize and believe. We might accept it intellectually. We might say, well, in theory, God still works today. But if we were to ask, what about this specific situation? We might start to have more doubt creep into our mind. And there may be various reasons why we let that doubt creep into our mind, which on their own merit may seem logical. It's hard for us to believe that God, who cannot be seen with human eyes, nor even understood and grasped with human minds, can be spoken to by human tongue. Somehow, you and I, who are stapled to weakness and mortality, are able to bridge the invisible and impossible gap and somehow reach out to the eternal. And perhaps the most shocking thing of all is that when we speak to God, He hears us. And not just passively, as though we might hear traffic in the background noise or hear the wind blowing, but that God makes an active effort to hear us. We're told in Psalm 34 that the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous. And in Psalm 116, He inclines His ear. God stoops down and listens intently when we speak. And the hardest part of all of this may very well be that we can't prove it with the tangible evidence that we crave as humans. And barring the miraculous, we have no choice but to accept it in faith. And that is a very difficult thing to do. We may believe that God does hear us, but can we believe that God actually cares? You know, if God didn't care, I don't think I could blame God for not caring. Why would God care? God is bigger than the universe. God created the universe. Perhaps he's just too big to care about something that's so small. You know, if I were to pray to God and he were to respond back to me and say, Michael, I hear what you're saying, but there's 8 billion other people I've got to listen to right now. Just take a number like you do at the deli counter and get in the back of the line and I'll get to you when I can. I would not be able to fault God for saying that. And yet, he doesn't do that. He's not too busy upholding the universe. He's not too busy listening to the other 8 billion to hear about my temporary and physical and emotional concerns. And maybe that's the biggest thing that affects me personally, as I've been reflecting on my own prayer life over the last several months and thinking about what are the things that impede me from really believing that God cares about me. It's my smallness. It's the fact that the things that I most often pray to God about are openly and exclusively temporary in nature. And sometimes I feel ashamed to pray to God about something that I know at the very end, when this world is burned up and all of the elements melt away with intense heat, as Peter says, that I'm standing there on that day of eternity and I don't even remember these things. They're just a blink in the eye that just gets further and further in the rearview mirror. So why, if on that day I won't remember these things, why does it bother me so much now? And that's what I'm praying to God about. Things that I know won't matter in the end. And if God would even say that, Michael, it won't matter in the end, I promise you. I would say, yes, I know it won't matter in the end, but I still feel it now, and it still hurts now, and it's still keeping me awake at night now. God understands that too. Life on earth is hard. Does God actually care? I want to start by saying emphatically and clearly that God says that he cares. In answering this question, let's start first with what God says. He says that he cares. I've chosen one of the simplest passages, one that perhaps we're very familiar with, to illustrate this. I think God shows that he cares when Jesus teaches us to pray in Matthew chapter 6. And he says, pray like this. In verse 9, Our Father who's in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Thought of daily bread refers back to the Israelites in the wilderness who were completely reliant on God to feed them. They were in the wilderness, they didn't have food, and they cried out to God. Not often in the best ways did they cry out to God, but they did, and he fed them on a daily basis. The food would drop down from heaven in the form of manna, and they would pick it up every day, and they were only supposed to gather what they needed for that day so that they could be reminded the following day that yes, God cares for you today too. He cares for your temporary hunger, things that won't matter in the scope of eternity, but he cares about your daily needs. And perhaps it's made so clear when Jesus instructs us to pray to God for the things that we need on a daily basis, our daily bread. In Matthew chapter 6, moving on in the context of this same discourse that Jesus gives, he says in verse 25, and I'll read verses 25 through verse 32. He says, For this reason I say to you, do not be worried about your life as to what you will eat or what you will drink, nor for your body as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air, that they do not sow, nor reap, nor gather into barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not worth much more than they? And who of you, by being worried, can add a single hour to his life? And why are you worried about clothing? Observe how the lilies of the field grow. They do not toil, nor do they spin. And yet I say to you that not even Solomon in all his glory clothed himself like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Let's take just a pause there. He gives us two illustrations of things which As I mentioned, this difficulty that I have is praying about temporary things, and maybe you share that with me. But he gives us two illustrations here of very temporary things. Birds. Birds are cool. I guess some people think they're cooler than others. They're fun to look at. You can watch their patterns, and you can look at birds like you can look at any other part of creation and see God's power demonstrated. And yet, birds are very temporary. And, we're not going to be able to get an idea of something that's grand and necessary and impactful just by looking at birds. And yet birds catch the eye of our Father. Birds in all of their temporariness and all of their littleness are important enough to God to where God takes the time to feed birds. You could say the same thing about the grass of the field, and he even says, the grass of the field is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace. In other words, temporary. We know it's temporary because God tells us what he's going to do with the grass of the field at the end of time. He's going to throw it into the furnace. And yet, grass is clothed with glory, more glory than even Solomon and all of his wealth and riches and wisdom. And if God's going to take the time out of his busyness to worry about grass, then why won't he take the time to worry about you who are made in his image? Are you not worth much more than they? So God cares about grass. He cares about birds. And if he cares about those things, then he'll care about you too. In verse 30, he says, you of little faith. So then, do not worry, saying, what will we eat or what will we drink? For or what will we wear for clothing? For the Gentiles eagerly seek these things, and your Father knows that you need these things. God explicitly says that he cares about little things. He cares about temporary things. He cares about things that are only pertaining to this temporary earth because he cares about you. But more than just what Jesus says, God, through Jesus, demonstrates that he cares. He doesn't just say that he cares, he shows us that he cares. We read a passage from Luke chapter 7, verse 11 through 17 about this widow who's lost her son and she is weeping. And it says that Jesus felt compassion for her and said, do not weep. And I'll consider that word and keep that in your back pocket because we'll read another story, one that touches me. In Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45, a leper comes to Jesus. It says, beseeching him and falling on his knees before him and saying, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And it says, moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. I specifically like this version in the book of Mark. This story is recorded for us in three of the four Gospels, but this is the one version that uses this phrase, moved with compassion. It's that same word that we read in Luke chapter 7 about the widow who had lost her son. Moved with compassion. Compassion moved Jesus. In this verse, we see some of the natural, instinctual, involuntary response that often comes with humanity. And we see it in Jesus, who was God, who took on flesh and learned what it was like to be human. It says that compassion moved Jesus. Not that Jesus chose to be compassionate, but Jesus saw a circumstance and naturally compassion welled up within him. And Jesus found that he was having these strong feelings of compassion. This word compassion is one that you won't probably stumble on much, but I'm going to take a moment to share it with you. The word here is splanknitsomai. And remember what it looks like because there will be a spelling test at the end of this. I'm just kidding. Splanknitsomai is a very unique word, and sometimes I choose to share what it means and sometimes not. I'll choose to share what it means with you this morning. Splanknitsomai means to be moved as from one's bowels, hence to be moved with compassion. In that day, the bowels were thought to be where love and pity were seated. A good comparison of this might be what we consider the heart. When we think about all of the love and the strong adrenaline that flows through our veins and the beating of our hearts when we are called to fight or flight, we think, wow, that person's got such a strong heart. We even think about David as somebody who was passionate for the Lord. He was a man after God's own heart. Well, here we see, and it was thought at that time, that the bowels, the deepest parts of you, the most inner parts of your being, that's where love and pity sat. And it makes sense if you think about it, because we often feel that. When the children in our lives fall down and scrape their knees, or they are feeling sorrow, they've lost their favorite toy or whatever it may be, a small thing, don't we have that gut response to pick them up and hold them and solve whatever problem is weighing heavily on them? We have that gut response to rescue them. And that's the same gut response that Jesus had here. It welled up from the deepest parts of his being when he saw this man whose life was absolutely wrecked by leprosy. His body was in pain, most likely constantly from this disease. He was likely depressed and anxious and at his last rope, and he falls before Jesus and acknowledges the divine power of Jesus by saying, if you are willing, you can heal my wrecked life. And Jesus wants to rescue that man. He wants to lift him up and pick him up and just hold him and fix the problem in all of its temporariness. He could have easily said to that leper, I'm only here for 3 years, man. Like, I get it. This is really hard on you. I've got other things that I've got to do. But he doesn't say that. He rescues this man and touches him in his leprosy and says, I am willing. Jesus was moved with compassion, and we see him being moved with compassion. He doesn't just say, I care. He shows that he cares. In many of Jesus' miracles, he demonstrates that he cares. In raising Lazarus from the dead and seeing his sisters weeping, Jesus feels those same tears welling up in his eyes as he weeps with them. In healing the paralytic in Luke chapter 5, as he is lowered down from the roof, Jesus shows that he cares about all of our hearts and our temporary body's diseases. In healing the centurion's son, he shows that he cares in Luke chapter 7. And these miracles were not just a demonstration of his power over nature. There are plenty of those as well. These miracles were shown to show us that God cares about people and the things that they're experiencing here on earth. And I want to show you one more passage. And this final thought here that I'll share with you bears much more extrapolation. But I'm gonna open this thought, and I'm gonna share this one passage with you because it's become important to me over the last few months. And perhaps I had read it at one point in time and forgot about it, or maybe I had not read it, but it was shown to me and it's been moving me. And I think it will with you too. In Daniel chapter 10, a great passage here. And I'll give you just a little bit of the background, but I won't open the whole thought here. Daniel is a prophet who is in captivity in Persia, and he's been serving. First, he served Nebuchadnezzar in the Babylonian Empire. Now he's serving the Persian Empire, Darius specifically. And he's been given this vision. And the vision is incredibly troubling to him. It basically puts him in a catatonic state where he just doesn't feel the strength to get up. He doesn't feel the strength to take care of his daily processes, bathing and clothing himself and eating. He doesn't have an appetite to eat. And this has been going on for 3 weeks, where he's just been catatonic and mourning before God and praying to God. And here at the end of this 3 weeks, we see an angel come to Daniel. It says in verse 10, "Behold, a hand touched me and set me trembling on my hands and knees. And he said to me, O Daniel, man of high esteem, understand the words that I am about to tell you and stand upright, for I have now been sent to you. And when he had spoken this word to me, I stood up trembling. And he said to me, Do not be afraid, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart on understanding this and on humbling yourself before your God, your words were heard, and I have come in response to your words. Again, Daniel's been on the floor, figuratively and literally, weeping for 3 weeks. And sometimes when we are in that same position, we might have this thought, how many times do I have to pray before God hears it? Am I not saying the right words? Is there a secret combination or a secret password? Do I need more words? Do I need less words? What do I have to do to be heard? The angel says, from the first day, your words were heard. I'm sorry. God hears every single word. And that's brought me great comfort. And I hope it brings you comfort too. He hears every word. And let me read the next 2 verses and give you another thought to think about, because I don't know what you're going through. I don't know if you're in the midst of this same situation that Daniel's been in, and perhaps you need to hear this today. And I don't know if maybe you're on a peak and the valley is coming, and I need you to remember this. Hear it now so that you can have it in your pocket when you need it. The angel then says, the prince of the kingdom of Persia was withstanding me for 21 days. And then behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I had been left there with the kings of Persia. And now I have come to give you an understanding of what will happen to your people, for the vision pertains to the days yet future. Now, I'm not going to unpack everything that this means, and perhaps that's already been done in our recent study of Daniel that we did out here in the auditorium. But let me just explain this paragraph very simply for you in this way. Sometimes there are reasons beyond the scope of our understanding as to why and when God chooses to respond in the way that He does. Sometimes we will be given the answer. Maybe in your own life you've had moments like that where you did pray to God passionately and you didn't get the answer you were waiting for. Either the answer was no, or either you didn't receive an answer at all until weeks later, or months later, or years later. And then perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, you were able to see God's wisdom and providence in answering the way that He did at that time. Or perhaps you've not received an answer, and you won't receive an answer until we cross the bridge of mortality and are standing with God. And perhaps at that reason we'll understand. At that point in time, we'll understand. Whether or not we receive the answer here that we are wanting so badly, just know this, that sometimes the answer is beyond our scope of understanding right now. But that does not mean that God doesn't care. And it certainly does not mean that He's not listening, because He is. He hears every word. From the very first word, God has heard. And He hasn't just heard in a passive kind of way, as in background noise, but He has bent down to hear you. And I hope you remember that. I hope you remember that God hears your prayers today. And I hope that if you can remember that He cares, that you might have the courage to pray when it seems like no one cares. And it seems like you're going to be stuck with these problems for the rest of your life. I hope in those dark moments, if you're feeling them today or if you feel them tomorrow, that you will remember to have the courage to pray to a God who cares. If you are a Christian this morning, you have a God who invites you to call him Father. He's not just this distant, deistic being, far off, out of reach, but he is your Creator who has invited you to call him Father. And if you're a Christian, then today you have that privilege of reaching out to God at any time and knowing that he wants to hear what you're about to say. And what a privilege it is to carry everything to God in prayer. And this morning, if you're not a Christian, I want you to know that God wants you to be his child. He wants you to have that relationship with him. And he has paid the ultimate price to bring you into that relationship with him. And that price is the blood of Jesus, whose blood and his life was shed for us so that we can have that relationship. You become a child of God by becoming baptized, by uniting yourself with the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And that's found in the waters of baptism. I know so because God says so. And you can be baptized this morning if you've not. That's how you begin that relationship with Jesus, by obeying his call to baptism. And if you've already been baptized and you need prayers of this congregation this morning, I also want you to know that prayer is effective and that having people pray for you is a very good thing. And there are people here this morning who are willing to bring your name to their Father and your Father in heaven. If there's any need of any person here this morning, won't you make it known while we stand and sing our invitation song?